Our next panel is titled Consumer Credit, a case study in model transparency and algorithmic bias, moderated by Dominique Harrison, Director of Racial Equity Design and Data Initiative with Citi Ventures Innovation. Please welcome Dominique Harrison and the panel.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I am Dr. Dominique Harrison, Director of the Racial Equity Design and Data Initiative at Citi Ventures. One of the things that we're looking to do is operationalize racial equity in the product development life cycle of digital products and services to advance financial inclusions for Black and Latinx communities. So this discussion is particularly of importance and interest to me, and I'm happy to welcome our panel. This panel will consider how improving model transparency helps support identification and mitigation of bias in underwriting models used for consumer credit. In particular, this session will investigate issues related to responsible development, implementation, and use of machine learning underwriting models, including evidence related to available tools designed to help lenders develop, explain, and manage machine learning underwriting models. I want to first introduce Professor Laura Blattner, who is an assistant professor of finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Her research interests are banking, corporate finance, and macroeconomics. Next up is Brad Blauer. He is General Counsel of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Over the course of his career, he has worked as an advocate on civil rights and consumer protection issues with the federal government and in the nonprofit and private sectors. And last but not least is Brian Kreiswirth, who is the Managing Director and the General Counsel of Responsible Banking and Consumer Data at JPMorgan Chase. His team provides guidance on legal and regulatory issues in the areas of fair lending and responsible banking, community reinvestment, language assistance, consumer data use, analytics, and modeling, including AI and ML. Welcome to my panel. All right. So, advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning have revolutionized our approach in a number of industries, including financial services, as we've spoken about today. However, there are a number of concerns about the ways in which machine learning algorithms may perpetuate or exacerbate systemic discrimination, in lending for people of color. There is also an ongoing debate in the machine learning community about how to define and measure fairness and whether awareness of protected classes features can increase accuracy and fairness of machine learning underwriting models. So I want to begin with Brian and Brad. Can you talk a little bit about how you look at fairness from the perspective of an advocate and industry leader?
We absolutely can. And thank you so much, Dominique, for moderating, and thanks so much for inviting me to this panel. So I think one of the most interesting things about financial services, and it's been mentioned before, is that as a very highly regulated industry, we actually already, for a long time, have been addressing existing legal and regulatory requirements on these very issues. And we'll start by talking about fairness, and then later we'll talk about explainability and adverse action reasons in particular. And so we start where the law and the regulations start, right, which is with thinking about both disparate treatment risk, about the direct consideration of prohibited bases, and also about, perhaps more importantly, disparate impact risk, which is focused on neutral policies and procedures, like, for example, models, that may result in disparate outcomes on a prohibited basis. That rule, and as well as the rule that we'll discuss about adverse action, applies to all credit decisions, right? Whether those decisions are model-driven or not, whether the model is AI ML or not. Having said that, compliance with this requirement has certainly become more complex in an age when we are driving towards machine learning and potentially utilizing somewhat less transparent models. But when we think about fairness, and I think we'll certainly get to points about thinking through how we can evaluate models that have been built in order to mitigate risks of bias or disparate impact. But actually, I think it's very important, I'm sure Brad will agree, that from both an industry and an advocate perspective, that we start by thinking about the data that's actually going into those models in the first instance. I think prior panelists have pointed out that one of the advantages of machine learning techniques is that they enable the consideration of a far broader swath of data, which can be very helpful with respect to those who may lack information from traditional data sources. But from a fairness perspective, as we think about the data that goes into models, machine learning, or otherwise, we think about a number of things. We think about ensuring that the data are representative, right? We want to build a model that's going to be able to predict effectively for both across the population, but also for various subgroups within the population. We obviously want to avoid the direct inclusion of prohibited bases or close proxies for those prohibited bases, although maybe, Dominique, as your question implied, we should talk a little bit about whether being more aware of those factors, if done carefully, could actually improve outcomes.
Yeah.
We also tend to, and the OCC has very helpfully provided us guidance with respect to this point, think about putting data into models that has an understandable relationship to credit. And so while on the one hand we want to incorporate new pieces of information that may allow for a sort of broader view of folks, by the same token we want to make sure that we're not sucking into our models attributes whose relationship to credit is not self-evident or articulable. And finally, of course, we want to try to avoid encoding bias. We've talked about that. Certainly the prior panel was focused on traumatized data sets. Thank you, Dr. Turner-Lee, for that phrase. We're clearly thinking about that as well. Of course, part of the point there is to ensure that the data sets are representative, but also it's important to ensure that the data that we're pulling in isn't itself infected with bias. That may be a little bit more challenging in other contexts. For example, if you were building a hiring model, and that hiring model was utilizing data about who was hired in the past, it's entirely possible that those past hiring decisions were themselves discriminatory, and obviously using that information, as some have found, will actually drive discriminatory decisions in the present. Hopefully that's something that is less of an issue, although obviously not an issue at all, in the context that we're discussing here today, right? The use of machine learning in credit underwriting, in particular because a credit underwriting model is going to be built on very recent data, and it's going to be built on data about very recent default activity. And so we, rather than sort of relying on prior potentially biased employment decisions, we're actually looking in the very recent past at actual defaults. So that certainly helps. I feel like I should stop talking, Brad, and give you a chance to jump in. But there's certainly more to the fairness assessment, but that's the sort of beginning. Even before the modelers begin their model development process, there's a lot of discussion about what's even going to be incorporated into that process. And then, of course, during the course of that development process, there are robust activities that compliance professionals will engage in interaction with the modelers to ensure that we've evaluated those models and worked to identify potential alternatives that might mitigate bias risk. But let me leave it to my advocate colleague.
Well, I would just add to what Brian said that, I've worked on the industry side, and now I'm working for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and thank you for including me today's panel. The NCRC is really focused on financial inclusion for low and moderate income communities and communities of color. And what I would add to Brian's definition, from an advocacy perspective, when you're thinking about fairness, we want to make sure that when you're applying for or even seeking out information about credit, that you have reasonable and equal access to what the information is, different product lines, that you're not being steered to just certain products and not the full array of products offered by the company, and that you're considered based upon your individualized credit characteristics, not based upon where you live, where you shop, the click-through rates of people in your neighborhood, the profitability of people in your neighborhood, because those things all skew heavily towards white people. And so we have to be really careful about that. And we were discussing before the panel, So a classic story of a company that got it wrong, one of the big tech companies, I think you can figure out which one, was deciding who to give same-day delivery of services to. And they were looking at, well, let's go to communities that have good roads, that have a lot of computer systems and good Wi-Fi connections. Well, it was a PR disaster because when they launched the program for same-day delivery, it was all white communities. And so they had to do a retread and add additional communities to the mix. The other thing I'd add is, it's very important that when you're thinking about fairness, you also look at the types of data that are proxy for race, gender, ethnicity. And so the work that FinRegLab has done, for instance, on cash flow and looking at other types of, alternative data is really a misnomer. This is like core data that you should be considering as a lender when you're looking at ability to repay and debt capacity. So those are a lot of the fairness criteria that we look at. I would also add, one of the key things, and we can talk about this a little bit later with model development, is making sure that you have a diversity of perspectives when you're developing your models and thinking about your underwriting criteria and things like that. If you just get a bunch of people in the room who are looking for the shiniest whistle to include in the model, which modelers often are, and you don't have training and you don't have people who come from different life perspectives, you're not going to be as sensitized to the issues that often drive disparities in the use of models.
Even just sorry, Dominique.
No, go ahead.
Just building on that point, I think I think we've all agreed, and I think we've heard it multiple times today, the importance of the diversity of perspectives and diversity of life experiences, absolutely. And I think in connection with the sort of model development process at a bank, which is obviously what I can speak to most directly, I think it's also important that that process is guided not just by model developers, but also by the model validators. And we heard from the head of model risk at Wells Fargo earlier today, and also by the legal and compliance colleagues who can bring to bear the concerns and questions about fairness. And so we actually, not only do we spend time sitting at the table, not at the end to review the model that's been created, but from the beginning. We're also, even earlier than the beginning, I'm here with my colleague, David Hickey, who's the head of the model development group for risk and fraud at Chase, and his new model developers get trained early on by myself and by the head of fair lending in order to sensitize them to these issues from the get-go.
Yeah, I really appreciate the response to this question, because I think one of the things that comes up is that you have this definition or a perspective of fairness or bias that comes, people have different purviews within one organization. There's a different legal kind of understanding of it, a different understanding as you're building a model as a data scientist, or if you're a sociologist as myself, or as Dr. Turner-Lee said, in terms of informing these kinds of conversations based off of historical, political, and environmental things that have impacted specific communities. So I wanted to level set with, having an understanding of that word before we kind of really jumped in. And so, one thing is that Congress has tasked specific federal agencies with ensuring that companies that develop consumer financial products and services operate transparently and efficiently to facilitate access, fairness, and innovation. And one important issue is how complex AI models address the requirement by creditors to provide consumers with the main reason for a denial of credit or other adverse actions, which was spoken about earlier. I wanted to hear from you, Brad and Brian. How are you all addressing this requirement in machine learning models?
Do you want to start?
Well, I'll go first this time. So, I think one of the main things, and I had experience working at a bank as well, one of the beauties of having to give these model reasons codes for denial is if you have to sit down at a table with your peers at a company and decide, this is what we'd have to say to the applicant, and you're like, that sounds horrible. Like, I don't want to have to say that to someone, then that's probably a bit of data that you should not be including in your model. So that's one thing. And then one thing that we at NCRC have really been pushing is for companies to really think about only including data that people really have the agency to make a change to. You don't want to include immutable data that it's going to be very hard for someone to change their behavior in your models. You want to be able to give reason codes if people don't get the credit that they asked for or on the terms that they sought, that they can actually look at the reason codes and say, oh, this is something that I should consider changing in my behavior so I can qualify for better credit. And we, in comments that we've given to the regulators on adverse action codes, we've asked that the Bureau and others consider an expandable set of reason codes so that people can get the basic reasons, but then they can open it up and get a deeper dive on, there could be visuals included, to really make it clear what you can do to change your behavior to qualify for better credit.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Obviously, as lawyers, we're complying with the requirements as they are. As policy participants, we may think about what the requirements could be. Yep. Although also I think it's very valuable, again, to hear from a financial services perspective about this issue, because I think the way that we experience this requirement or could iterate around this requirement may help, as I think Melissa may have suggested before, think about how similar requirements might migrate to other contexts and might provide similar values of transparency. But the current requirement, of course, says principal reasons, says usually no more than 4 principal reasons, and really requires more or less that those reasons be accurate, the ones that were actually used, and that they be sufficiently specific, right? So a lender can't simply say, you didn't meet my score threshold. They need to actually articulate why you didn't meet their score thresholds. Of course, this requirement definitely becomes more complex when you're utilizing more complex modeling techniques. I know we've had discussions today about sort of different approaches to explainability in this context. Obviously, one solution is to build models that are inherently interpretable, and that's certainly an approach. Other approaches, and I certainly understand that these approaches are sort of gaining adherence, are approaches that may employ more complex modeling techniques and then use sort of post hoc explainability methods, and I'm sure that Dr. Blattner will talk about how exactly those tools were performing in the research that she's going to describe. But interestingly, in the discussions that sort of we've had about complying with current adverse action requirements, setting actionability aside for just a sec, we actually are trying our best to take the same approach that we take in the logistic or simple model context and try to transplant it as best we can into the machine learning context by using techniques for evaluating the contributions that the perhaps greater number of variables in the model are making to the outcome. As far as actionability is concerned, I think there's a significant policy advantage in it, right? In telling folks what they can do to improve their chances of approval. It's one of the things, again, that we'll talk about in the research. It's not a current requirement, and there, to some extent, I think there are quite natural attributes that might go into a model that may not be directly actionable except by waiting. For example, you recently went bankrupt. Sadly, the only solution to that is to wait for that bankruptcy to sort of age. But certainly it's sort of worthy of policy discussion and also potentially worthy of meeting the current adverse action requirement and perhaps creating some flexibility for lenders to make suggestions as to things that could be changed to improve chances of approval.
And just really quickly, I'd like to add, there's been a lot of discussion at today's conference and outside about the black box and skepticism about AI. And I think it's good to have a healthy skepticism, but also there's a lot of promise for AI to really expand access to credit and products. So we come into this as NCRC as wanting to work with industry to find common ground on ways to really use it. So it's not a black box. So if you're using a vendor, you really need to understand their model and explain it. We saw the whole Facebook issue a couple of years ago where Facebook was having some issues about explainability to its companies that it worked with on marketing. And so a lot of companies pulled back because they weren't comfortable because they couldn't explain what the vendor they were working with was doing.
And I'll double down on that. I think the machine learning, by bringing in more data and by capturing more complex interactions, has the risks that we've discussed, but it has the benefits of improving the ability to predict what we're trying to predict, right? Which is in this context at least default. And when that ability is improved, it is often our experience that will enable expansion and access.
So I want to invite Professor Blattner into this discussion. You've been working together with FinRegLab on some empirical research on the explainability and fairness of machine learning for credit underwriting. So I want to get your perspective on how you think about fairness and explainability and follow that up with just sharing some key takeaways from the research that you've been conducting.
Thanks, Dominique. I mean, it's tough. So just about a number of times today, we've heard the words fairness, explainability, interpretability. It's clear that these are key threshold questions when it comes to the decision, are we adopting these black box models? But at the same time, there is no one definition of fairness or model transparency. So the way I like to think about these terms is fairness generally refers to some disparity in the model, either with respect to model predictions or model decisions. Whereas interpretability or transparency is more about, can we see where certain model behavior is coming from? So this could be the adverse action notice requirements, understanding why a certain applicant was rejected, or it could be in the fairness of fair lending analysis, figuring out what is driving that disparity the model is exhibiting. So in the research you were mentioning, in fact, this morning, the FinRegLab, together with my colleague at Stanford, Jans Spies, and myself, published a research report that thinks about these key threshold questions in the context of consumer credit. So what we wanted to know, can we actually look into these black box models? Can we make sense of what they're doing in the context of consumer credit? And so we partnered up with 7 of the leading AI companies in the space who are currently developing methods to work with these black box tools and black box models. And what we came away from, and well, in fact, we have a whole day tomorrow talking more about those research findings, but I'll give you the high level now, is that I think we can be cautiously optimistic on the use of these more complex machine learning models in consumer credit. Because what we found is that some of these tools that we looked at were actually pretty good at both figuring out why a certain applicant was rejected, as well as figuring out why these models seem to be exhibiting disparities across protected groups. Now that's the optimistic part, but I also want to highlight the cautious part. And so there's 2 parts to the sort of cautious aspect of things. The first one is that you really have to pick the right tool. So you can't just take any off-the-shelf method and expect it to do well. What we found is that not all tools perform well, and you can't expect the same tool that will tell you why an applicant was rejected to also be the right tool to explain to you why a model is exhibiting disparities. So that match really matters. And the second reason for caution is that you have to be careful in how we interpret these tools. And maybe to lighten it up and give you a non-credit example, let's assume that we're looking at heart attack risk. And let's assume that a model told us that I have a higher risk of heart attack than Dominique. And so we ask, Brian and Brad, why might that be? And Brad tells us, well, it's because she exercises more. And Brian tells us, well, because she eats more healthily. Now, those could be both true, reasonable reasons, right, why the model is suggesting that I have a higher risk than Dominique does. But it might not be that seeing any of these reasons in isolation is enough for me to change my behavior. It's not enough for me to exercise more. It's not enough for me to eat more healthily. I really need to be doing both in conjunction. And that's the sense in which we have to interpret the output of these tools, not just in isolation, but with a broader view of in the context of other aspects of the model that might also be relevant for behavior.
That's really getting interesting, and I saw some of the highlights from your research, so I'm really excited that you're talking more deeply about them tomorrow. I wanted to kind of get to a more solutions-oriented part of this discussion. Effective fair lending testing requires entities to search for and adopt less discriminatory alternative models. And Brad, I wanted to start off with you. You've been working on finding common ground with the industry on this approach. What are some of the actions and steps that creditors should explore and adopt when conducting effective fair lending searches for less discriminatory alternative models?
Well, I'd start out by saying, about a year ago, the NCRC has what it calls its Innovation Council. And so we meet periodically with about 8 or 9 key players in the fintech industry. We also have a bankers council, community bankers council as well. And we've talked with them about disparate impact. And last year, the Innovation Council, these fintech companies and NCRC, came out with basically a statement saying disparate impact is here to stay. The companies embraced that framework for looking at their products and services and financial products, and made a commitment to applying the 3-part test of, you have to have a legitimate business purpose for if there's any disparity, and you have to make sure that there's not a less discriminatory alternative. That's the three-part test. So, I think what we would expect and what we've actually advocated to the CFPB is that the Bureau and the prudential regulators could give more guidance upon how regularly should companies look at their models to determine that there's not a less discriminatory alternative. Could the Bureau and others, and this ties in very nicely with NIST and what it's looking at, could there be guidance on what is practical significant? What is just noise in the system that's not really discrimination versus something that really we should be concerned about, and the lender should have to do a deeper dive if it finds there are disparities above a certain level. And then also looking at self-testing. We really want to encourage lenders to do self-testing, including sampling demographic data and collecting data about your race, ethnicity, and gender, not for the purposes of underwriting, but for the purposes of validating and calibrating and making sure that the models that you're using are accurate and are fair. And so those are all things that we've advocated to the Bureau that they consider by way of guidance, because it would make it much more easy in some ways for companies to implement an effective disparate impact framework if they had some more guidance. Now, the tendency has been with the regulators to say, well, we know discrimination when we see it. And that's been the MO so far, but we're pushing with industry as well for a little more teeth in terms of setting some bright lines that I think would be helpful to the industry and helpful to consumers as well.
One of the things that your research made me think about, Laura, is that many banks rely on third-party kind of companies to develop these models, to test for these kinds of things, and so you must really kind of be intentional about understanding the ways in which those third-party organizations are operating, or the tools that they're developing that can in fact may produce more discriminatory outcomes, or could do better than the tools that you're creating in-house. But I would love to hear from you, what are some of the diagnostic tools that can be useful for users of machine learning models?
Yeah, I can give a flavor of that. So I would say, again, the key message is not every tool will work, and you have to match the right tool to the right task. So to give you some examples, for example, if we're going back to the adverse action notices, trying to identify the main reasons for a rejection, for example, what we found are that diagnostic tools that use some form of the SHAP explanation package perform pretty well at identifying those important drivers for a rejection. In contrast, if we're trying to explain why a model is exhibiting disparities, something completely different works pretty well. So what's key there is that you combine information about what aspects of the model matter for the predictive performance. And it doesn't really matter if you use the SHAP package or something else. But what's important is that you combine that information with information about what attributes of the model tend to be related to protected class, which variables are highly correlated with protected class information. And it's really bringing those two pieces together that's highly relevant. And to pick up on something that Brad was just talking about, we also looked at exactly this question. Are there approaches that allow us to find less discriminatory alternative models? And one thing I found very surprising was that these modern automated approaches perform really well at tracing out a menu of models that combine different predictive performance and disparities. And they really outperformed what I would call the more traditional method, where we first identify some of these drivers of disparities and then drop them from the model and rebuild our model from scratch.
So, thinking about this, conversation, and I also want to invite the audience to come to the microphones to ask questions in the next couple of minutes, but this question is for the entire panel is, what are some of the judgment call that lenders have to make, and what other guidances can be useful to lenders on this topic?
I can start. Of course, Brad has lots of ideas, both from his advocate perspective and a former lender perspective. And of course, you've already offered a couple of them, right? There are definitely ways in which lenders are very keen for more guidance, and regulators sometimes understandably reluctant to provide it. But in this context, I do think that actually providing the guidance will actually enable broader adoption of models that may expand access. And so in that respect, it could be really beneficial all around. I think that and to be clear, we would love and appreciate more guidance, and it would help a lot. we manage these questions without it. There are lots of lawyers like me and compliance professionals and model developers who can manage with a more general legal regime and regulatory regime. However, we need to make a series of judgment calls, Dominique, much like you were suggesting, and having a little bit more directionality in guidance from the regulators would help. Laura mentioned the sort of choice of fairness metric. There are multiple metrics that are used, and knowing which ones are, in the regulator's view, the right ones to use would be super helpful. Meanwhile, many of those metrics, beyond those metrics of fairness, some, and frankly the CFPB has suggested as much in some of the blog posts and other discussions that it's had on this subject, that one potentially relevant metric of fairness is whether a new model outperforms an old model in terms of its expansion and access. But of course, the new model could also drive disparities. And so being able to balance those two imperatives is quite important. As Laura mentioned before, oftentimes that search for less discriminatory alternatives produces a menu of options. That menu of options, if it was properly generated, is truly a trade-off between whatever metric of fairness you've chosen and accuracy. And ultimately, that's a very difficult trade-off to make because fundamentally it's a policy trade-off, right, rather than a legal or regulatory trade-off. And so more guidance in that respect would be super helpful because we are often left with a choice that we need to make between two very important factors, without much guidance. Less spoken about, but certainly occasionally important, are trade-offs which we don't want to make between protected classes. Right? We'll often find that some models will improve outcomes for some groups and occasionally worsen outcomes for others. And so, I mean, again, we make reasonable judgment under those circumstances, but understanding exactly what the expectations are would be helpful. And finally, I would also pivot back to what Brad was mentioning before about alternative data. Yep. I think we got some incredibly helpful guidance, I would say prompted in perhaps significant part by FinRegLab's wonderful research on cash flow underwriting from our regulators in December of 2019 about the use of cash flow data in underwriting. And I would say that that's a form of, quote, alternative data, although that may not be the best description for it at this point, that's seeing widespread adoption. Yeah. There are many other potential types of data. I would say that organizations like mine and probably many others are a little reluctant to think about those broader sets of data, notwithstanding the benefits they could provide, because of concern about how our regulators are likely to view models that include them.
And just touching upon Brian's point about fairness versus accuracy, I mean, we've actually advocated to the regulators as the NCRC that often you find lenders are, in a way, paralyzed when they have to make a choice between accuracy and fairness because they're worried on the one hand, if they're less accurate, then they have safety and soundness concerns with those regulators. We've argued you should be able to turn the dial a little bit towards fairness and lose a little bit of accuracy and not get dinged by your prudential regulator in doing so. And we also think you shouldn't be penalized for looking for and implementing a less discriminatory alternative. It shouldn't be viewed in and of itself as a indicia that your previous model was inferior. No, you're leaning in and you're improving your systems, and you should get credit for that.
Absolutely. I mean, they all have major, outcomes or impacts for the communities that we're most concerned about, which are people of color. And the data shows what that can mean for their livelihood and what that means for wealth building and a number of other issues. But I want to turn to the audience, the first person to come to the microphone.
Hello, Tim Duncan, FinTech Commons. Thank you for a really informative conversation. It's been great. I had a question for you. We found last summer Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac decided to include rental data in their credit decisioning process. And lo and behold, from what I've read, that expanded credit by about 15 to 20% in terms of approvals to people that otherwise would have gotten denials. So what does that say? Something that's right out there in front of everybody, rental data that has such a tremendous impact on an important area, one of the most important areas in the wealth gap in our country. And then secondly, what about special purpose credit provisioning that's going to be coming through now, where I would imagine banks and financial institutions are going to have to, if nothing else through competition, going to have to overtly target credit programs to underserved ethnic race groups, et cetera, right? Isn't there going to be an impact in terms of the credit decision, that on the credit decisioning, and how do you see that playing out?
I'm happy to take the first part and I'll
Yeah.
pass on the second part. I think there's this strange norm in US credit scoring that people with no data and people with a bad credit history or bad data kind of all get lumped into a bad credit score. And so a lot of what alternative data does is sort of take these two groups apart again. And so that's why something like rental data or cash flow data can be so powerful, because we've lumped everyone together and now we can differentiate again. And I think that's why we tend to see these relatively big gains from some of this alternative data.
Yeah. And I wholeheartedly agree, although I think the cash flow underwriting data is more readily available. And so I think that's why that's perhaps what explains some of the challenges in pulling in rental data to the decisioning processes. I wholeheartedly agree with your point about special purpose credit programs, right? So I think all of the work that we're talking about here is critically important, and yet we operate in a world where even when we make the adjustments to the models that we're all looking to make, those adjustments are likely to be incremental. So they're likely to be an important step, but really only part of a step. And so we will still be in a place where, given the hundreds of years of history that have built us up to this point, there are still significant differences in access. And so I do want to make sure we don't, important though the questions that we are asking and debating here are, that we don't put on the backs of our models, machine learning or otherwise, the task of fully addressing these equity concerns. I think one of the most beneficial things that we, and I mean I'll speak as Chase, because we've been quite open about our push into special purpose credit programs in multiple contexts in the last couple of years, for the very reason that neutral models, well tested and adjusted and incrementally adjusted to address fairness concerns, still produce significant outcome differences, and we can address in a very targeted way those outcome differences through tools like special purpose credit programs. I would also say, and shout out to the OCC and to Gruvetta, who I know moderated the prior panel. The OCC's Project REACH, which is a highly sort of collaborative effort, includes as one of its components getting, again, additional data into lenders' decisioning processes, which doesn't need to be modeled. It can be sort of just taken in as a positive signal, much as you were suggesting, Laura. And so we should definitely think of models and ensuring fairness in models as one part of the story, but we need to think about the other chapters that we need to write as well.
And I would just add, I totally agree that special purpose credit programs, which are basically programs that lenders come up with to target underserved communities with a special program like down payment assistance or additional marketing or easing underwriting guidelines for people who are close but don't quite qualify for credit, are really important. And we're at this time in the regulatory system where all the regulators are agreed, you can do this, you're not going to get burned from a regulatory perspective in doing it. So, we've been pushing industry to get more involved, to get more traction in this area. And one thing that banks can do is, if the model doesn't qualify you for credit, the bank can partner with the CDFI or another group that will offer credit to people who aren't quite meeting the underwriting requirements of the banks. You can partner with another institution that will give a sustainable loan.
I want to invite our next two questions, and because we have limited time, I'm going to ask you to ask your question, then the next person to ask, and then we can respond.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the great panel. I'm Himala Karaju. I'm an assistant professor at Harvard. I spend most of my time developing methods and theory for explainability. So few things struck to me as the discussion was happening. One is, when we think of using methods like SHAP to give adverse reason codes, right, or give reason codes for people to act upon them, As somebody who spends a lot of time developing these methods, I know that they have several vulnerabilities. One of them is they may not always be accurate. The other two well-documented vulnerabilities are that they lack consistency, which means if I run the same method repeatedly, I might get different answers. And they lack stability, which means if I make a small change to a data point, the answers that I get can be drastically different. So if I'm using such methods to give actionable insights to people, and if they're not entirely reliable themselves, I worry a little bit about what would be the implication of that, so I'd be curious to hear more comments from the panel. Another thing that I also wanted to highlight was in the broader literature on explainability, there are several methods, like SHAP is one of them, LIME is another, and each of them captures a different notion of feature importance. One fits a linear model, the other computes Shapley values, and in fact we have some recent work which says that if you ask a simple question of what are the top 3 most important features, you will get different answers from each of these methods. So how do you consolidate this with sort of giving these as reason codes to people?
Thank you. And we'll invite the next question.
Thank you. I am from Salesforce AI. The question I have is, if we abstract a little bit from the financial domain, what we're talking about here is quality and trust for our AIs. And quality and trust is always stakeholder dependent because we've had regulations, et cetera, in the food industry, but what McDonald's thinks about health quality of hamburgers is very different from what one of us thinks about. So there is this power dynamic there that different stakeholders have different definitions of quality and trust. What's the thinking there on academia? How can we empower stakeholders to express their definition of quality?
All right, you want to start with Laura?
Yeah, I'll start with Hima's 2 great points. And I think it's important to make 2 distinctions. One is about, and I think the lawyers brought this out nicely, the principal drivers of a decision versus an actionable path. So what we find is that some of these tools, and again, not all, contrasting LIME and SHAP, for example, are able to provide important drivers of the model. If you ask them to write an actionable path to acceptance, that is a much more challenging task, as we find and document in that report. And again, I want to be clear, we don't find that all the tools perform well. Some perform well. And also, again, we very much find this inconsistency in the sense that you'll get different answers. It's not always clear that one answer is right and the others are wrong, and I think my little example was trying to illustrate that. And so again, I think I want to be careful in saying a tool identifies the driver of a decision of a model, as opposed to a tool identifies some important drivers of a model. I think the latter we have confidence in, the former we cannot say.
Right.
And I mean, I would only add on the explainability front that there are obviously a lot of techniques available, and there are a lot of obviously entities providing services that utilize those techniques. Speaking as a representative of one lender, although I am certain that this sort of research is going on everywhere, or at lenders that are, let's say large enough to have those internal resources, we're doing research of our own to confirm our choice of explainability method and that it meets the sort of consistency and stability requirements that you were raising. Although again, there really are just inherent limits, and I think Brad drew them out before, to the adverse action notification requirements, right? They do meet important goals, but they don't necessarily provide, they don't have to, and they don't necessarily provide a path, an actionable path. And in fact, I think there are some who would suggest that trying to meet adverse action requirements only by providing, and this is definitely not what you were suggesting, but if we only pointed out those things that were actionable, we probably wouldn't be complying with the adverse action requirement, because it really is looking to find the up to 4 most important drivers of the particular individual's decision.
Brad?
I don't have anything to add to that other than I feel like I'm on a podcast of Between the Ferns with the ferns up here. But I've really enjoyed the panel.
Thank you so much to our panelists for a great discussion, and thank you everybody for your questions and your participation.
Thank you.